You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I am joined today, as typically, with my colleague Steve Damaris. Howdy, Steve.
Good morning, Bronson.
And Steve, we have a treat today. We are joined by Assistant Professor and Extension Wildlife Specialist at Kansas State University, Dr. Drew Ricketts. Drew, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I listen to y'all a lot when I'm driving around the state, and it's kind of nice to be on the podcast instead of be listening to it, I guess.
Well, we are honored to have you. I'll tell you what, Drew, before we dive into the topic at hand, if you don't mind, tell people your background, just generally. What do you do for Kansas State?
So Kansas State, our wildlife extension program is different than a lot of them. I took over as the main extension wildlife specialist in November of this last year, I guess. I had an extension role before, but I was focusing almost entirely on habitat management and some youth wildlife education. The extension specialist here is responsible for wildlife damage throughout basically statewide. And so we help producers who are struggling with problems like coyotes killing calves and sheep and some of these issues that we don't have wildlife control people around the state that are trained to deal with it. And so if you can't hire somebody, you're going to call me and then I'll come teach you how to do it on site. But I also do a lot of the regular extension wildlife stuff, giving county programs and helping the agency with habitat management stuff and getting the message about science-based wildlife management out to the public. And I also teach some classes. So I teach a wildlife habitat management class and a human wildlife conflicts class here at K-State.
Steve, we always have some really fun conference calls. Drew and I are on a committee together for wildlife habitat education program, a youth education program within the 4-H system, and teaching them habitat management principles and so forth. But our conference calls are colorful. The last time we were on board, I got to listen to Drew and another colleague compare and contrast trap sets for badgers versus talking about, grading systems and all the stuff about the semester. I got to hear about badger sets. So that was cool.
Well, I'm not sure it helped you out tremendously.
Well, it was cool to hear it. I really don't get a lot of calls about trapping badgers in Mississippi, but it's fun to listen to.
Well, Drew, while you were describing all the things that you do, it was like I was tallying it up into my head, and that's about 150% of your time, sounds like.
Yeah. It's a very busy job, but I enjoy it because it gets me out working with stakeholders a lot. And I sort of went after the extension wildlife position when it came available here because I'd known the history of the position and working directly with producers is something I've always enjoyed doing and wanted to make a career out of. So it's a lot of work, but it's work that I really enjoy.
Well, Drew, what we wanted to at least attempt to tackle today was, I guess simply put, what's so special about Kansas? And what I mean by that is that, especially in the last decade, but before that as well, Kansas has really become recognized, at least in the East and Southeast, as one of those destination places for out-of-staters to go hunt. And if you look at Pope and Young record books, Boone and Crockett record books, etc., all time, last 10 years, etc., Kansas always is in the top 10 and sometimes top 5. And my personal story was that when I was working with you a couple years ago, we were outside of Manhattan, and we were in kind of some, correct me if I'm wrong, historic tall grass prairie. Maybe it was short grass prairie, but prairie, how about that?
Tall grass
And
prairie, you're right.
Tall grass prairie. And I don't know if you remember this, Drew, but I was probably off to the side when you were talking more sophisticated range management techniques with some of our colleagues, and my mouth was agape because the landscape, to me, as an outsider, looked so much different than what is depicted on, let's say, a hunting TV show. And specifically, what I mean is that if you're riding down the road, or you're watching a TV screen or something like that, you see all this grass. You see this waist-high, shoulder-high grass, and it gives the impression that if you're not in a little forested area, a drainage, and if it's not an agricultural field, all it is grass in Kansas. And when you and I were walking through the prairie, I was literally overwhelmed with, like, this is the perfect structure for producing deer food. And what Steve and I, the way we would call it in the Southeast, would be old field. It looks like a managed old field, meaning that there was structure from grass, bunch grasses, but it only comprised maybe 30 to 40% at the most. The rest of it was forbs. I mean, just knee-high to waist-high, broadleaf plants, meaning deer food. And so I started connecting the dots, thinking that is one of the reasons they're producing so many good deer in Kansas, is that you've got this prairie with all this deer food, and it's not attributed to grass, it's attributed to forbs. So I am perfectly capable of swallowing my ego if I got it all wrong, but I'd love to get some feedback from you. Did I read that right?
Yeah, you read it right for sure. And where you were at when you made that observation is sort of in the northern part of the Flint Hills region, and it contains like 80% of the world's tallgrass prairie that remains. And the reason it's still there is because the country was too rough to farm, basically, and so it didn't get plowed up. And that tallgrass prairie is still there because it's one of the best areas to produce cattle during the warm season. There's a huge amount of biomass that grows because we get enough rainfall for eastern deciduous forest, but through disturbance, fire, and grazing, basically, it's been maintained as prairie. And when cattle interact with fire on that landscape, they're going to graze the areas that have been burned most heavily, and they will most heavily graze the areas that have been burned recently, and then they will sort of stay out of the stuff that hasn't been burned recently. And when you get that intense grazing after burning, the grazing suppresses the grass. It doesn't kill it. It doesn't really hurt it, but they graze it down, right? And that allows those forbs to express, is what we would call it in the range management world. And when you have a good combination of fire and grazing in that landscape, it just produces a crazy amount of plants that are deer food, for sure. Throughout the rest of the state, there are a lot of different things going on. We have a pretty, to me, amazing rainfall gradient or precipitation gradient across the state. So down in the southeast corner where I grew up, we get about 4 feet of rain a year. In far western Kansas, it's about 15 inches on average. And so just the productivity gradient that comes along with that change in precipitation produces real high deer densities for us in the prairie, in the eastern part of the state, and much lower densities out west. But even though you don't get as much primary production in western Kansas from the native plants, there's so much agriculture that there's food everywhere. I think that you'd be hard pressed to go anywhere in our state and find a place where deer could be considered food limited. And so that's one part of it. Steve, I heard you say, wow. And even in western Kansas, where we've been doing our deer study that we just wrapped up, we would catch does during February and early March that had an inch of rump fat, that are pregnant. And so they're just not food limited here. It's cover if they're going to be limited on something.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting, Steve, to compare and contrast that with our colleagues in the Midwest. It's a cover limited system, and for us, it's more of we have to be careful. We can't say it's a food limited system strictly. I think we have to qualify that and say it's a quality food limited system in the Southeast. We have the long growing season. We have rainfall, too much rainfall in some places. There's food. There's green plants everywhere. It's just of limited quality. So certainly a big difference there.
Yeah, it's a matter of convincing landowners that everything that's green is not deer food.
And in eastern Kansas, we run into that a fair bit. Once you get east of the Flint Hills, so between, let's say, a line running north and south from Topeka and then on over to Missouri, most of that range land is not actually rangeland. It's fescue pasture. And so we have a lot of fescue pasture, but even though that's there, there's still so much soybeans and wheat and then eastern deciduous forest type stuff with hedge trees and lots of browse mixed in that, there's just food everywhere.
Well, Drew, why don't we start with maybe it's the older I'm getting, stuff like this interests me more and more. But what do you think is best the historical records depict and what you've been taught in school, so forth? If we were to back it up 500 years or so, before European colonization, what did Kansas look like?
It was mostly prairie. In far eastern Kansas, and really, so one of the interesting things about tree cover, and looking at the woody expansion that we've had today from that time, but then thinking back to what it was like when the settlers came through. The town I live in, Council Grove, is kind of a neat record of this, because it was the last place on the Santa Fe Trail where they could get oak to fix their wagon wheels. So we're here in the Flint Hills. We're sort of at the western limit of the bur oaks and the chinkapin oaks would be the two species that are most common here. But east of that, there would have been mostly riparian timber. Some historical accounts from the part of the state that I grew up in, down in the very southeast corner, say that the Neosho River, which is one of our big north to south drainages in eastern Kansas, had a riparian area that was about a mile wide when this country was settled. But beyond that, it would have been tall grass prairie with a few scattered trees. And then as you move further and further west through the state, following that rainfall gradient, it would have transitioned from tall grass prairie to mixed grass prairie, and then to short grass prairie way out west where there's so little rainfall. And the further west you go, the fewer trees, and cottonwood trees would have been probably one of the dominant species where there were trees once you got way out west. And then there's even some sand sage prairie and different ecosystems like that way out west too. But it was mostly prairie. Tons and tons of bison that would have sort of been nomadic. We can't say that they migrated, but they roamed around. And I talked a little bit about the interaction of cattle and fire on the landscape, and that was very, very important historically, we think, with bison. There were natural fires from lightning, but probably more common than that were fires that Native Americans started that the bison found. Basically, once the growing season started, they would find those patches of grass that had burned most recently and graze them pretty hard for a short period of time and then move on. And so it was just this mosaic of areas that had been recently burned and grazed heavily, which stimulates that forb response that you saw. And then areas that hadn't burned maybe in 3, 4, 5 years, if we're in the eastern part of the state, and maybe a lot longer way out west where there's a lot of buffalo grass and that sort of thing. Lots of pronghorn, mule deer, elk, grizzly bears, mountain lions, black bears, wolves. So very different faunal community or mammal community than what we have right now. A lot of the state was probably mule deer country. Whitetails were probably restricted to riparian zones at that time.
Drew, I was doing a little bit of research for our recording here, and probably not enough. I never do enough research, but one thing that struck me, mainly just from the bias that we have today with the abundance of whitetail deer, it was a publication. I think it was put together by your state wildlife agency, but historically, that whitetail deer was not the dominant, by a far stretch, the dominant large mammal on the Kansas landscape. It was essentially relegated to eastern Kansas and to those drainages and woodlands, and that bison and pronghorn and elk dominated the landscape much more so than whitetails.
Yeah. Whitetails were not the dominant ungulate, that's for sure.
So another thing that was interesting for me to read was a very similar story Kansas had that we have in the Southeast, which was whitetail deer in Kansas were essentially practically extirpated from the state, along with probably, of course, elk and bison, and it goes on and on. And that's, over harvesting, unregulated harvest, and all the scenarios we know about. But I'm curious, Steve and I have done some work with examining in the past the history of restocking. Is there still a legacy genetically, of some of those sources that were brought into Mississippi and the Southeast? What was Kansas? What did they do? Did they just protect what existing deer they had that were native to Kansas? Did they engage in any restocking?
It was natural repopulation with almost definitely we would have had immigrants from Missouri from the restocking efforts that they had there. There are some, I think, anecdotes maybe of game wardens moving some deer around within the state. But Kansas did not undergo a restocking effort for white-tailed deer or mule deer. Both of those species sort of repopulated on their own after they've been protected for 100 years or so.
Gotcha. So, Drew, I am curious, what is the correct pronunciation, Missouri or Missouri?
Depends on where you're from. I grew up in eastern Kansas, and where I'm from, the people around Joplin that I knew, they called it Missouri. The folks that I know from the Kansas City area say Missouri, and they look at you like you're an idiot if you say Missouri. So I think it just depends on where you're from. I'm sure the correct pronunciation is Missouri.
So I'm going to test you, Drew. I'm going to spell a word, and I want to hear your
Uh-oh.
pronunciation.
Okay.
Acorn.
Acorn.
There you go. There you go.
That was a double test. You had to actually visualize the word and then actually say it.
Yeah, I thought when he said AC, I thought he was going to make me try and say Atchafalaya or something like that.
No, I can't even pronounce that. So Drew, one of the things too is so you have this amazing landscape that's not food limited. If anything, as you said, it's cover limited. Keeps the deer population from just building and building in certain areas. So I'm wondering about the harvest system of Kansas, and I think Steve and I may have talked about it in the past on a podcast, but if not, I guess a quick review is a lot of the Midwestern states that we would say the bread basket, the corn and soybean areas, not only are they in unlimited food situations, but they also have a harvest system that really limits gun harvests and primarily rifle harvests of bucks. And so you got a whole bunch of food to feed those deer, and then you have a 7-day, 10-day, 12-day, I believe Kansas is 12-day. You only got 12 days you can harvest them with a rifle. I'm wondering if you know, is there a management reason for that very narrow gun harvest season? Or is it like a lot in the Southeast, it's just tradition? That's kind of the way we've always done it. That's what people are used to, and we're going to keep doing it that way. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, what I remember from what our retired deer biologist told me years ago when I was collecting deer heads for him one time for a CWD project was that our deer season was designed to avoid rut, or excuse me, our rifle season was designed to avoid rut, and be relatively compact so that the deer weren't over harvested by rifle hunters. And you know, the timing, now that we do have some data on that, it's pretty clear that the rifle season is a week to 2 weeks post peak rut. The deer have pretty well reduced their activity levels by the time the rifle hunters have access to them. And that sort of goes along with something that Kansas has always had a history of, and that's been that the emphasis of the deer harvest has been on the does. It's always been that it was easier to get a doe tag than a buck tag when we had a draw system for residents. And then once that draw system for residents was no longer in place, you can get many more doe tags than antlered deer tags and have access to those does during a much larger period of time. And I think that's a big reason too, from a management standpoint, that we do have maybe an older age structure of bucks than some states do, and that sort of thing. I think a reason for us versus the Southeast that more compact rifle season is important is that the deer just have a whole lot less cover to hide from rifle hunters. You know, this sort of long-range hunting phenomenon that's become popular in the last few years. You don't have to go to the mountains to harvest a deer that way. You can harvest a deer at 800 yards in Kansas if you want to. It's not something I'm going to do, but you can.
I think you'd have to be on a power line right away down here, Steve, to get a 800-yard shot.
And how would you actually make that shot? Way beyond my capabilities.
Well, younger people, Steve, that their visual acuity may be better, you know. They routinely pull it off. Well, Steve, I've been yakking a lot. Let me open it up to you for some questions.
Well, we've looked, Bronson and I have looked at many different factors that affect antler size in males, and one of the things one of the numerous things that have shown a lot of explanatory power are variations in soil, major soil types, regional soil variation. Are there any big changes in soils across Kansas?
Yes. Unfortunately, I probably don't know as much about that as I should. But there are areas where we have a whole lot of sand in the soil, the eastern part of the state, especially where we've got this tallgrass prairie ecosystem. I mean, extremely productive soils for the most part, but the clay content and soil depth and all of those sorts of things they vary drastically across the state depending on where you are. You can dig a pond with a bulldozer pretty easily down where I grew up, and there's enough rain that it'll fill up, and there's enough clay in the soil that it'll hold water. But in other parts of the state, like here in the Flint Hills, you might only have 10 inches of topsoil. Soil nutrients and those sorts of things that might have a bigger impact on antler growth. I can't speak a whole lot to that. I do know it varies throughout the state, but I'm not very knowledgeable about that.
Are there areas of the state that are historically known for producing more larger antlered bucks?
I think when you talk to folks who travel around to hunt, they might talk about that a lot more. What I've seen in the state is that if you're in an area that doesn't have as high a hunting pressure, you're going to see those trophy bucks. So I think it from my point of view, just from what I see anecdotally, I think it's more about hunter access to the deer than probably any sort of variation in soil nutrients or those sorts of things. I don't think deer body size varies all that much in the state. If it did, it would probably be on a north-south type gradient rather than an east-west. But we don't have that much variation in deer body size.
Interesting.
But
what about land use variation? In the southeast, we have a lot of variation in ag versus timber versus rural developments and a variety of things like that. You've mentioned cattle grazing and agriculture. What are the major land uses out there, and are those any value in explaining?
You just said the two main ones, agriculture and cattle grazing. So if it's native prairie, whether whichever of the three types of a native prairie, it's going to be used for cattle grazing. And if it's not native prairie, then it's probably been tilled. Some of that tilled ground has been put to fescue, like I mentioned, or brome. We also grow a fair bit of smooth brome in Kansas. And then most of the rest of it is going to be cropland. The further east you go, the more timber there is, but it's going to be relatively concentrated around big drainages in riparian zones. And then I think the big exception to that would probably be we do have a little bit of cross timbers type country, sort of on the western edge of southern southeast Kansas. And so you get that blackjack, post oak, savanna type stuff mixed in with tall grass prairie and some agriculture. But the dominant land use is going to be row crop production, cattle forage production from alfalfa and the two tame grasses I mentioned, and then a lot of row crop agriculture as well. And it's, I think if we're thinking about, where the white-tailed deer are, like you mentioned before, they're going to be concentrated around drainages once we get way out in western Kansas, and so they're going to benefit from that mix of agriculture and prairie, with a little bit of timber, but it's going to be mostly cottonwood savanna type stuff or early successional timber. And then the further east you go, then we start getting more browse species that are important in the timber. But we don't have very much timber production in Kansas, and what timber production we do have is going to be in areas that couldn't be farmed, and so that's going to be, if it's bottomland type stuff, it's going to be oak hickory timber with some hackberries in it. But our bottomlands would be very different from yours. And then in the uplands, there are some barrel staves that would be harvested out of the bur oak trees and some of the chinkapins. Really good black walnut in some areas. And then we also have a lot of pallet wood harvest from hackberries and ash trees and that sort of thing. But I think that during the times of the year when deer might be food limited in other places, that access to those row crops is really important to them, probably. And then when we manage prairie right, like we talked about, that prairie cover, I don't want to say prairie habitat because then I'll get one of your other podcasts yelling at me. But the prairie cover that we get and the food that's interspersed in that prairie when it's well managed is very important too. That was a very long-winded way of, I'm not sure if I answered your question or not.
Well, you talked about a lot of different aspects of it. That was great, Drew. What about how much active fire, prescribed fire, is applied to the landscape?
In this Flint Hills ecoregion where I live, we have a very, very good fire culture for cattle production. Here in the Flint Hills, having 2 million acres of prescribed fire in a year is not a crazy year. And that is cattle producers conducting prescribed fire on private land. That's not with government agency involvement. We have very good fire culture here in the Flint Hills. In other parts of the state, though, folks are understandably scared of fire. And so the further west you go, the less likely it is that you're going to see prescribed fire in the prairie. Very little prescribed fire used as a habitat management tool in forests. What prescribed fire we do have in forests, for the most part, would be spillover from fires in the tallgrass prairie for cattle production. There are especially state wildlife areas that would have some prescribed fire in the timber and some private individuals, but not a lot. We need to expand our prescribed fire in the eastern part of the state in forests for sure as a habitat management tool.
Well, Drew and Bronson, I know you gave me leeway to start talking, and I'm going to pause after this question. If I can remember what it was I was going to ask. Drew, you've been really kind of cagey here about telling some of our listeners who might be thinking, well, all right, man, this is the Kansas guy. He's going to tell us where to find the big bucks. You've been pretty cagey. You talked about a lot of the variation, and so it sounds like you want to go to Kansas and hunt where there hasn't been a lot of harvest, because that's where there's been less pressure. But can you come up with some general rules of thumb for someone new to the state?
One of the one of the things that's challenging about that is, just to use our deer project that we did out in western Kansas as an example, we found very large bucks in some of those drainages, just an hour and a half east of Colorado, and so I think just about anywhere you go in Kansas, if you can find a riparian area, and not necessarily a riparian area that looks like what you think would be deer habitat. I mean, one of our study sites, the tree density was almost non-existent, but those deer are using canyons and the topography that's there. Fawns are using yucca plants for cover, hiding cover as fawns. I mean, it's so different, and it can be so different, I guess, from what most people think about for whitetail hunting. The highest densities of deer are going to be in the eastern half, though, and so if a hunter is coming from out of state and maybe doesn't have a ton of time to scout and that sort of thing, probably your best chances of finding and harvesting a larger buck are going to be in the eastern half of the state. One of the challenges for an out-of-state hunter coming to Kansas is we're only about 3% public land, and so just cold rolling and thinking you're going to go to a wildlife area and find a deer to hunt is maybe very difficult. We do have a program that we call WeHaul, the Walk-In Hunting Area program, that leases the hunting rights from private landowners. And so that, I don't know the acreage number, but I would say that it more than doubles the public access in Kansas. But a lot of that, especially way out west, is going to be focused on pheasants. So, if they're looking to come to Kansas and find deer, they're going to need to spend a fair bit of time, probably on Google Earth, locating those big drainages that have that, some sort. Riparian timber here would be used very loosely, because we might be talking about, a draw that's got 20 yards width of trees that's running up through the Flint Hills or something like that. So looking for a good mix of those woody draws, some native grass cover, and cropland. I mean, just finding areas that have that mix, or if you're somebody who wants to chase deer through those canyons, way out in western Kansas, finding those canyons, and if you can find public access in those canyons, you're going to find deer, and probably big deer.
So, Drew, if I could nerd it up a little bit here, in terms of frequency of encountering, let's just say big buck, 150 plus, however you want to describe it, your chances are probably better in the eastern half, just because of deer population size, because you have a more uniform distribution of cover. So you got a bigger deer herd. Some of those are going to be really big, and is going to be dependent on hunting pressure, private land, as to how many of them get to older age classes. You get over to extreme western Kansas, again, they're not really food limited, but in that situation, they're more cover limited. So the deer population's distribution on the landscape is a lot more closely tied to the drainages in those areas like that. So the deer population may be smaller numerically, but they're still not food limited. And so
exactly,
you have fewer deer, but unless they're hunted heavily, they're not food limited. They get older, you're going to get big bucks. There's just probably fewer of them out west as compared to east.
Right. Yep.
Well, that's a good problem to have, Steve, to not be food limited statewide. Man, oh man,
Mm-hmm.
That's a luxury. So, Drew, go ahead, Drew.
Oh, I was just going to say it's a challenge, though. Being somebody who's trying to help folks manage their deer populations, or their deer herd, every other thing that they see on the internet is talking about how we need to produce food to manage deer. And it's not the case in most of Kansas.
Yeah. We have a few areas in Mississippi that are like that. I mean, across the board, we would say it's food limited in a lot of places, but there are some places in our ag region that, without a doubt, it can be a cover limited situation. So we understand that. So let me follow up something, Drew, with your appointment in extension and like you said a moment ago, working with landowners that want to manage deer. What is your garden variety mistake that you would see someone make? So if I were to just fictitiously say garden variety, you get a phone call, it's 1,000-acre property, and they want more deer or bigger deer. What's typically things do you see that people are doing wrong or could do better?
I think there's a couple of things that I would say that I could call mistakes, like you're talking about. One of them is not harvesting enough does. We've depending on where you are in the state, in addition to your either sex permit, you could also get up to 5 Doe tags. So every landowner or every Kansas citizen has the opportunity to harvest 5 does and still shoot an antlered deer. And depending on what unit they're in, non-residents that are managing land here could do the same thing. So not harvesting enough does, and then that I kind of hinted at it a minute ago, but having that food mindset. They're especially a lot of the deer management that's going on private land is in eastern Kansas, where we have much more, I'm going to call it timber. Y'all wouldn't call it timber. But we have a lot of forest cover that's been allowed to mature just like it has in the southeast. And so it's closed canopy. We don't have sunlight hitting the ground. Maybe cattle are being allowed to graze in that timber, not being excluded from it. And so there is no understory cover. And when we add cattle into that, they're also competing with the deer for all the high quality browse plants that are within reach too. And so not managing forest cover, trying to throw food at a problem that food's not the answer. Those would be the 2 biggest things. And a couple of easy solutions are just some thinning, especially the crop tree release type thinning that's real easy to do, and some prescribed fire in the timber. And then as we move further west, even here in the Flint Hills, we have folks that buy land to hunt on, and it may be a 1,000-acre cattle ranch. It might be a 5,000-acre cattle ranch. It might be a 100-acre pasture, but they bought it to hunt, and the first thing they do is pull the cattle off. We're not gonna graze, and we're not gonna use prescribed fire. We're gonna let it go back to nature, is what a lot of people, I hear that. Well, if you want to manage tallgrass prairie for deer, you need to be burning it and grazing it, and there's specific ways that we can do that to produce better outcomes. But pulling cattle off and stopping the prescribed fire program in the prairie is one of the worst mistakes that folks do when they buy hunting land in Kansas.
Drew, kind of a follow-up with that, and I feel like you and I are teaching a WEP course when I ask you this question. But let's just say that this is probably very much oversimplified, but I'd be interested to hear your strategy here. Let's just say someone has 500 to 1,000 acres. They bought it sight unseen. They get there, they got 1,000 acres of prairie. no forest land, no, nothing like that. And you identify that you need some cover. You need some cover, some woody cover, something. How would you go about recommending they develop that cover? Would it be like in the Southeast, just walk away from it, let succession happen, and trees are going to colonize the site and grow? Would you have to plant trees in your environment? What would you do?
That's a hard question for me to answer. Not because it's hard to get trees to grow here. It's because our prairie is so valuable from an ecological standpoint that I would hate to see anybody come in and plant trees. If you just totally walked away from it, no burning at all, and no grazing, within 20 years you would have lots of plum. You'd have lots of wild plum. You'd have lots of eastern red cedar. You'd have lots of honey locust. You'd have lots of Siberian elm. And, some of these species are valuable from a food standpoint. Some of them are not. You can also get cover that's not woody cover, right? And so what I would encourage that landowner to do would be to develop a fire and grazing program that would leave residual cover in the form of grass. And so we would do maybe some patch burn grazing, where if that's 1,000-acre pasture, we're going to burn, 333 acres a year and give cattle access to that whole thing. And so they're going to do what the bison did and just graze the tar out of what we burned this year. And then next year, that's going to blow up into forbs. And then the following year, it's going to transition back to mostly grass cover. And that's going to give you good litter for your next fire, fuel for your next fire. We're producing food, we're producing cover, we're doing all that within that prairie system. Unless you're way out west, there's probably going to be a little bit of woody cover on the property already in the draws and areas that are protected from the fire. And that's probably going to be enough as long as you have some cover out in that prairie. So if we're one of the really common cattle production strategies, especially here in the Flint Hills, would be to burn an entire pasture every year and then to relatively intensively graze that throughout the growing season. And so to start this, hopefully this isn't too fancy, but we're not producing any heterogeneity that way, right? The whole pasture is basically the same cover type when we do that. But when we start applying fire in a patchy way, then we can create cover that deer will really use. And especially if there's a little bit of topography on that property as well. When I've been out stomping around in the prairie during the wintertime, if I'm looking for deer, I'm going to go to the draws where there's a fair bit of residual grass from the last year, because those are the hiding places where those big bucks are going to go, rather than trying to find them down in the timber.
Yeah, it's really amazing. 3 or 4 feet of grass, 5 feet of grass. I mean, a deer is invisible, especially when they bed down.
Yeah, and I think some of the stuff that we've seen out in western Kansas just really reinforces that. They use the CRP like they would use timber out there. So that's tall grass prairie that's been transplanted into the short grass prairie ecosystem, and that's the cover, and they use it very heavily.
Drew, you've referenced a few times the research project you're a part of, and y'all just finished up, and I wanted to make sure we gave you enough time to discuss as much as you wanted to discuss about that. If you're at liberty to say kind of what were the objectives of the project, and I know you haven't analyzed the data and so forth yet, but if you had any just general observations as to findings, conclusions so far?
Yeah. So sort of the pie in the sky thing we were trying to get after was why are mule deer, why is the mule deer range contracting to the west? It's been sort of a continual process throughout the years that in the plains, mule deer have been declining in number and contracting to the west, while at the same time whitetails have been expanding and becoming more abundant in the west. I can't say that we've gotten to that yet, but we've definitely been able to make some generalizations, and a lot of it's probably not earth-shattering, but my grad student Mitchell Kern that did the fawn research, cover is really, really important for those fawns out there, and it's different kinds of cover, but he definitely found that in these very large pastures in the short grass or mixed grass prairie that get grazed heavily year after year after year, fawn survival is pretty low. And there's also some lower quality timber out there, or tree cover that doesn't have much of an understory, and fawn survival is pretty low there too. So there's sort of some ecological trap stuff going on with the whitetails potentially. And another thing with the fawns too is it's a very stochastic environment, kind of like South Texas, where they may not get very much rain. It's very unpredictable, and we haven't necessarily tied that to fawn survival, but from listening to some of the podcasts where y'all are talking about South Texas, it sounds like maybe the population dynamics are somewhat similar in western Kansas, where the fawn crop may come close to failing at times, way out west. And that's where this study was. So we were, one of our study sites was about 40 miles south of Nebraska and about an hour and a half in from Colorado, and the other study site was about another hour further south. So we were definitely in the short grass and mixed grass prairie country. The other thing that we saw is, and this is where some of the stuff that I'm talking about, harvest intensity is coming from, that there are areas where even on private land, access to the deer is really, really high. And in those areas, bucks don't live very long at all. And in other areas, there are a lot of landowners that are into deer hunting that may control a lot of land, and harvest is extremely low, even on bucks in some of those places. And so I think it's important, if you're coming to Kansas to hunt, to think about that hunter access issue. And if somebody wanted to have a really good trip here, it might be worth finding a place to hunt first, before going after that tag. Doe harvest and doe survival. Doe harvest is almost non-existent that far west, and in a lot of areas, I think that's okay, because the deer densities aren't super high. Doe survival is really high out there. Another thing that's pretty concerning, one of the study sites that we were at was where it was within 50 miles of where CWD was first detected in our state. And, you've got about a 50-50 shot of harvesting a CWD positive buck in that area.
That certainly can't help.
No. And when harvest is as high on the bucks and CWD prevalence is also as high on the bucks, it's a little concerning, I guess, in
Sure.
in that one area in particular. I probably shouldn't talk much about the doe stuff yet because that dissertation is still very much in progress. But um,
Well, let me follow up something you said, Drew. On your fawn survival, uh, what is primarily the source of mortality? Is it exposure? Is it predation? What are y'all finding? If you can
it's
share that.
yeah, that Mitchell's thesis has been out for a while, so I can talk about that. I'm not going to give any specific numbers because I don't know those right off the top of my head. But the exposure deaths were definitely higher probably than you would expect to see in the Southeast. We I think of the cause specific mortality, approximately half and half predation and exposure. We found they would find dead fawns laying out on the prairie sometimes, and that hadn't been scavenged or anything, which just sort of blew my mind because when we have an adult deer die, we can almost never get there before they've been scavenged on, even with GPS collars. So I think it's all linked though, right? If you've got fawns dying of exposure, then they're not in good thermal cover. And if you've got fawns dying from predation, it's not because you have too many predators most of the time. It's because you don't have good enough cover for them to hide in. And some of that goes back to what I was talking about, the fawns using yucca plants as hiding cover out on the prairie.
Just a general question then, Drew. I think regionally this differs in terms of general impressions people have about the impact of predators. Especially the southeastern U.S., really robust coyote populations are new, and again, relatively speaking here, kind of new, couple decades, and they initially, especially at a population scale, a particular property or wildlife management area type scale, coyotes move in, they can have a big impact, they kill a lot of fawns, and then typically, we start to see you change your harvest regime. You're still going to have deer. They may be at a lower density, but you still have deer, and you kind of work through it. And you kind of learn too that you're going to spend a lot of time and effort trapping coyotes with diminishing returns for doing that. What's generally the Kansas theme in that regard? Are people trapping a lot of coyotes and other predators to protect fawns, or is it just something that's old hat and we just accept it?
Well, there's been coyotes and deer together here as long as there's been coyotes and deer. So it's not a new phenomenon here. Coyotes are the main predator that kills fawns in Kansas, but I guess we don't have any coyote-free areas where we could compare population numbers in areas that have predation due to coyotes to areas that don't. There are a lot of people who talk about managing predators. There are some folks who trap during fur harvesting season with the mindset that they're doing some good for deer and that sort of thing. I think from the coyote research that's been done here in Kansas, we probably have as many coyotes waiting to fill a home range when a coyote is removed from the population as we have resident coyotes who have a home range. Just as an example, when I was doing my PhD work with coyotes, I was on a preserve that's protected from harvest and had GPS collared coyotes that were going to a neighboring ranch that's surrounded by woven wire. And there was an outfit there trapping coyotes, not under the theme of predator control, but just because they were trapping. And, they had snares set in every opening they could find underneath that woven wire fence. And they harvested over 60 coyotes off of that property. And we didn't see a difference in coyote numbers in the area. And I had coyotes coming and going with GPS collars that they never caught. And I think when you've got a population of coyotes that has been established for quite a while, and you've got this social structure in place that they function under, where you've got residents and transients, and there's always an animal basically waiting to replace the ones that are harvested. And then you've got the compensatory natality stuff too, where they can increase their birth rates based on harvest pressure. I don't recommend that people try and conduct predator control at a population scale, even when I'm helping producers who are losing coyotes or losing calves or sheep to coyotes, because unless you start trapping and snaring and calling, and you do that for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, every day for a month or two prior to fawns hitting the ground, and then continue to do that until the fawns are 10 weeks old, you're probably not going to have an impact. If you're harvesting coyotes in the fall and the winter, when folks tend to harvest coyotes, they're going to be replaced long before you're dropping fawns or calves. And there's been some research, and lots of sheep producers talk about this too, that the resident coyotes are more likely to be the mouse eaters and the cottontail rabbit eaters, because they know where the resources are. Once you remove those residents and they're replaced with an individual who doesn't know the area very well, those are the individuals that are more likely to actually go hunting for those larger prey items. So I think I would never discourage somebody from hunting coyotes or trapping coyotes. I trap and hunt coyotes, even though that's part of my job. I still do it because it's something I enjoy and I grew up doing. But your money and time is a whole lot better spent doing habitat management than it is trying to remove coyotes, if you're trying to increase fawn survival or turkey survival or quail survival or any of these things.
That's real interesting, Drew. And I guess that's kind of our message as well. If you enjoy doing it, I mean, especially if that's your fun, you get fulfillment. And of course, a lot of people do trapping. If you want to do it, then by all means do. Just don't do it with the expectation that next year we're gonna increase our fawn crop by 40% because I caught 4 coyotes, on my property. Yeah. Have some realistic expectations of what's going to happen, and what we know that is tried and true return on investment is habitat management. That's always the safest bet in that regard, is managing your habitat. What about lions? Or I say lions, cougars, mountain lions, etc. I know they are more frequent now in Kansas. Do y'all kind of have a general estimate as to how many lions are roaming the Kansas landscape at any given time?
Well, we do not have a resident population of mountain lions as far as we know. We get confirmations typically from trail cameras, pictures from trail cameras. Every once in a while, somebody will find a track. We had some high school students that were raccoon hunting that treed one a few years ago. There have been around 30 confirmed lions in Kansas since about 2000. That's about when we had our first confirmation. 15 of those were actually last year. We had 3 lions, we think, that moved through the state based on the pattern of trail camera hits that are probably responsible for most of those 15 confirmations last year. But lions are definitely not a significant predator of deer in Kansas, and most likely at any given time, there's not a lion in Kansas. We have some transient individuals that move through that are dispersing from western states in these populations that have expanded, and they're usually young males trying to find a spot with good habitat and a female. And since they can't find any females, they just keep on going.
They move on.
Yeah.
Drew, what about the elusive Black Panther?
Oh man.
No response needed.
Most of my mountain lion calls are big black ones. And left a track the size of a gallon coffee can and that sort of thing.
I hear you. Well, Steve,
Drew, this has been great, and maybe you were just about to say the same thing. We've learned a lot about Kansas and why it's such good deer habitat and why it's a destination place for hunting. I'm going to ask you one last quick question, and then I'm going to be quiet and let Bronson wrap it up. Best football, Kansas or K-State?
Well, that all you have to do is look at the record. That's pretty easy. It's K-State.
Spoken like a scientist. He didn't give his opinion. He relied on the data. So
yeah,
that's right.
You can trust Drew. He is data driven. Hey, Drew, know you're busy, buddy. Really appreciate it. Glad it finally worked out. We've been talking about this for a couple months, so glad we could finally get together. You did not disappoint. You're a wealth of knowledge. Kansas State and Kansas itself, lucky to have you. We really appreciate your time.
Well, good. I enjoyed doing this, and hopefully I said a few things at least that are valuable to folks. So thanks
Absolutely,
for having me.
you did. Okay.
Thanks, Drew.
All right,
Yep.
Steve, Drew, we will talk to you later. Thanks a lot.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.